I'm Dan Graboy, and this is Life in Time of Pandemic. Today I'm talking with Andrew Levine from Germany. Hello, Andrew.
Hello, Daniel.
Where are you in Germany? Where do you live?
I live in Hamburg. Uh, uh, Pretty well. Hamburg is a small city. Germany is number two, but actually quite a small city. And I live in the outskirts, which is not too far to the center of town. Beautiful place with nature preserve, small houses, garden. Very nice.
About how many people live in Hamburg?
Oh, I think it's 1.5 million. I think, but I should have to check actually.
That's
Not
okay.
too
We
sure.
can all look it up.
Yeah, that's what I'm afraid of.
um, and how is the city doing as far as COVID-19? Are there a lot of infections? Not so many?
Yeah, well, the city was actually one of the early places for infections because it appears that lots of Hamburgers like to go skiing. So they went to Austria, and well, there was a big outbreak over there. They came back, and immediately they were all in quarantine here. So we had a bumpy start with all of this.
Have you flattened your curve now? Is it getting better?
Yeah, Hamburg is quite good actually. So it seems that the measures regarding social distancing, they're working, and yeah, so it seems to be under control.
So out on the streets, do you see not too many people and people who are masked and people keeping their distance and that sort of thing? And the density isn't such that, like in New York, where people are getting pushed together in
Yeah.
spite of the efforts to isolate, it's not working that well. How about in Hamburg?
Yeah, I mean it's New York is, I think, the densest or one of the densest cities in the US. So it's very difficult to maintain distance. It's much easier in Hamburg, and we have like the center of the city that is a bit more crowded, and some areas that are a bit more crowded. But the area where I live, sometimes I go for the morning walk with my dog, and we meet three people, and I walk for 1.5 hours. So yeah, that basically gives you an idea. There's much more people now outside. Most of them, they keep the distance. There is going to be like a requirement for masks, quite, I think, beginning next week. Um, it's still being discussed a lot if it's really how helpful it is. It seems that it's more helpful to wash your hands regularly and keep your distance. But anyway, it's going to happen. So if you go to busy stores or you go to the market, then you're going to have to wear a mask. Let's see. And well, I'm going to be going to Berlin tomorrow for a few streaming concerts. The first time I've traveled since all of this began, and it's going to be interesting to see what the city feels like, and how everything is handled there.
So let's talk about your career as a musician. You are basically an electronic musician, correct?
Well, I started out with violin when I was 6, and then I started singing. And well, I was very much into that. I spent 1 year in McLean High School in Virginia, where I was able to go to the orchestra and sing in the choir, and I also got into the madrigal choir in like an octet and everything. So actually, I was on the acoustic track for quite some time. Then I decided to study computational linguistics and psychology. So I majored in a completely different area. And then, well, things just happened that made me get into multimedia and audio and video recording and editing. And I became a Tonmeister about 18 years ago. So this turned
Meaning you
into,
produce recordings?
yeah, I produce recordings. So I brought some stuff. This is like with the Olivier Grave Ensemble, I produced a very nice piano trio recording, jazz, also lots of improvised music. So this is a fantastic improvising string quartet, Bruck. You should have to advertise this at every chance I get. We also did like a second CD. They're amazing. They come together basically not knowing what's going to happen and perform acoustic music and create something new every time they appear to appear together. So that's actually what brought me back on the music track.
So let's pause for a second before we continue on where you went, because I think the non-musicians who watch this may not know what a producer, a tone meister, does exactly. And I think it'd be very interesting to pull the curtain back. And I think everyone can picture you in the back room with headphones or speakers and the musicians on the stage or in a room playing, and talk about your role during production and post-production as far as how we go from recording session to final product CD.
Yeah, so I'm what they call a recording producer because I'm a one-man band running basically Bloomline Records, which is a mobile recording studio, originally only sound. Yeah, I came from video. I realized that sound just had to get better, and then like I said, I got into sound. So what a tone meister actually does, according to the definition, it's an idea by Schoenberg. He said we need people who understand the musicians. So ideally, they should be musicians, and they also are not afraid of the technical side of things. So they know how to deal with all this, and they can basically mediate. So in the ideal situation, you have the musicians on one side and you have the sound engineers on the other side. And in between, you have the tone meister, the sound masters. And he had this idea that basically you would go in two directions. You would study an instrument, preferably piano, so you can read complex orchestral scores, and you're able to basically understand what's happening musically, but you can also refer that knowledge back to the technical people. And of course, in the times where everything has become more easily manageable and accessible, these two roles have like gotten closer to one another. So nowadays, we of course also do the mixing. But yeah, and people come from different areas. There's like only two schools in Germany where you can study Tonmeister. There is Detmold and there is the UDK, Universität der Künste in Berlin. They have something called Diplom Tonmeister. But there are people coming from different directions. I think there's a course in Surrey. There's like some things in the US where you can study something similar or something called Tonmeister. It's not a protected name as such. So, but we have an association in Germany which is called Verband Deutscher Tonmeister, so Association of German Sound Recorders or recording artists or whatever. And we basically try to capture both sides. And it is still not easy. You find that many colleagues, they're more technically oriented. They have sometimes difficulty communicating with the musicians. So basically, I have to go back a little bit. It's not only technical and musical, it's also a psychological process. So for example, these CDs I just held up, they're live recordings. So this was actually quite easy to do because you set up, you think a long time about what you want to capture, but then you come to the space, you set up your stuff, you record, and it's done because there is only one shot. But other things like this Grave CD, you also plan a lot in advance, but then basically you accompany the process. They recorded Gabriel Fauré, Ernest Bloch, Debussy, Turina. Strangely enough, on the first CD, there is no Grave. We did record it afterwards. So you basically are helping the musicians get the best possible result. You take care of all the technical problems. You also try to realize when they're getting tired, when they're getting stuck on something. So you say, maybe we just leave this, go to another piece. You also make sure you get all the takes you need. If you don't have anyone else who's like keeping track of that, because in the end, when you do the assemblage, the montage, you need everything to be fine. and you run the session. So it is like it can be quite a extensive process. And of course, if you have a bigger team, then you can basically distribute the roles between one another. So the producer would actually be running the show. He would take care of the schedules. The tone meister would read the score and communicate to the technical people. The sound engineer would be writing the faders and stuff. But this can also be like a one-person thing, which I think makes it very nice. So I don't usually sit in a different room. I sit in with the musicians so I can communicate directly, which is, of course, something that is difficult today, these Corona times. So right now, because my specialty is live recordings, there's no concerts. And the other one is like studio sessions. There's basically no studio sessions. So that's why I'm looking at streaming and this kind of thing.
Right, because musicians' lives around the world have been put on pause right now. And what we do for an audience, and what we do, we need to be together. So of course, we're on hiatus, and there's no way around that as yet. I would like to agree with you on the psychological side of the producer. I've been involved with many, many recording sessions and found that with a small handful of producers, I am at ease and do my best work. And with others, especially those who are a little bit uncertain, it's extremely difficult to do. And actually, you'll be appalled to know that with my chamber ensemble, the Meridian Arts Ensemble, we now self-produce and we run our own sessions and we keep track of our own takes. And we've figured out how to do that, and it is exhausting, and it'd be much easier to have a person like you around, but it can be hard to find a person who puts you at your ease and gets you to do your best work. Also, when we started recording, we worked with a producer and an engineer who worked together as a team. And that was in the early 90s, but by the mid 90s, we were with a producer alone who had taken over the engineering duties. And as you say, I think that's becoming more and more common.
Yeah, it is. There's advantages to doing this like in a unified way. And the thing where it becomes difficult is, I mean, it's great that your ensemble is basically producing their own things, because then you are in complete control of everything. But I must say that nowadays, many times, because I'm performing more than I'm recording. So last year, I think, was the first year where I did more playing myself than recording other people. Yeah, and this year it is also happening. I mean, I had like the small US tour where I played, and because in this context you're the technical guy, they usually ask you to do the recording. So yeah, well, the thing is that I know what I want, I know how it's done, and it's no problem to do that. And it's after 18 years, it's become quite easy. But for example, this is CD oscillations, and that's why I come back to being an electronic musician now. 10 years back, I rediscovered the theremin. I had come across the instrument several times, and it's always fascinating.
For people who don't know what a theremin is, can you describe it?
Yeah, it is the first electronic instrument. So this year it's celebrating its 100th anniversary. It basically evolved from a device that would detect proximity to an instrument that you can play. So most theremins are like the Moog ether wave style theremin. So it's like a wooden box. It has a round antenna on one side, and it has a straight antenna on the other side. When you move your hand towards the straight antenna, you increase the pitch, so it goes up higher. And when you lift your left hand, then you increase the volume. That's the way it's usually set up. Of course, you can turn it around, doesn't matter. You don't touch anything. It's the only instrument, as far as I know, still that is played without being touched. You also don't have an indication of where you're at with regards to pitch. So if you stop the tone completely, restart, and just moved your hand slightly, or happen to take a breath, or your body just moved forward, you're going to have a different starting position. So it is very tricky. So I discovered 10 years ago, when I finally took the plunge and bought an instrument that, oh yes, my years of learning to play the violin and my years of learning to sing had definitely had its worth, its usefulness, because you need to be able to very quickly correct issues in pitch like a violinist. Of course, it's easier because you have your hands on the strings, and you have you have the length of the neck of the instrument to help you orient yourself. But it all depends on very, very small graduation of where your finger is and how it's touching with the bony part, how it's touching the string, and of course the distance between the string and the neck, which is different for every instrument. And also you have to use your skills from singing, because you want to phrase in a musical sensitive way. So anyway, this instrument really grabbed my attention, and I happened to meet a painter and sculptor, Anna Mandel. This is a picture of our duo called Sculpture Singing. And she said, you're a recording guy, couldn't you record me when I'm singing my sculpture? So what do you mean? What do you mean singing your sculpture? I said, yeah, well, she's a synesthetic. So she noticed at some point that she was singing along, and she was singing a sculpture that she was just modeling. And for her, it's like a immediate connection. She can really sing colors, paintings, spatial things like a sculpture. I said, yeah, of course, let's if you create some sound, I can record it, whatever it is. I mean, it's very soft. I have to be very picky about my microphones and preamps and cables and everything. Not that I'm not always picky about that, but I said, well, what would you say if I bring along my theremin? I just got the theremin. Oh, I heard a theremin once, and it's was really bad, really bad experience. So, well, no, I think it's going to be fine. So yeah, bring it along. So we met at the church that is just right next door, and we experimented together. And this was also my first introduction to free improvised music. And it turned out that it was a lot of fun. So we did some test sessions, recorded some stuff. This is where this CD is basically from.
And it's not a DVD, so we can't see her sculpting. It's just
no, you can't see the sculpting, but there's also some stuff. I can send you some links. There's also some videos of her sculpture where we're also playing and singing. So basically, we put these two ideas together in some points.
If you send me those links, I will put them down here below in the comments for people to take a look. I
will definitely do that. So then we thought, well, maybe this is also interesting for other people. So we did some test concerts, and we found out that other people really were into what was happening. So this turned into a regular duo. Then we added a saxophone player, Andreas Krennerich, and together with this guy, we produced the Oscillations, which is also nice. This is like a 4-format release. So it is good old stereo. It is a surround for headphones, a binaural mix. It is a DTS music disc, and there is also a high resolution version of that. And yeah.
Hold the CD up one more time for people who want to seek it out and take a listen. Awesome.
It's up on Bandcamp. I'm going to send you some links to stuff. Okay. I think it's quite interesting. And so basically, this is electroacoustic music, because we have the vocals, we have the saxophone, and we have the theremin as the electronic instrument. But the thing with the theremin is, because the audience can really see what is happening. It's not like someone plugging cables or possibly playing on a keyboard, where many times you also don't really see what is happening, and sometimes there's not a lot of differentiation, which is, I mean, a keyboard player that moves like this is not ideal. I mean, it's like many musicians, you can just stand very still and produce beautiful music, of course, and it can be detracting to move too much. But with a lot of electronic music, so at some point where we can come to the continuum later, it is not so easy to see the expressiveness it's not so easy to not only hear but to also see and realize this expressiveness that you can achieve with a acoustic instrument. So with the theremin, I think it's an ideal communicator for this electronic world.
So you brought up the Continuum, and of course we met over the internet when I was selling a Continuum, and we'll talk about what that instrument is. I have one in my lab here in Madison, but I bought.
Beautiful lab.
No, thank you. I'll put a link to my lab as well down below. I bought a smaller Continuum to use in Paris on my sabbatical, and you then bought that instrument from me. But in order to talk about the Continuum, I think maybe you could talk a little bit about the history of synthesized sound, just to bring people up to speed, and then we'll move to the Continuum. So can you tell us a little bit about Robert Moog and about oscillators, and just catch people up on the, without being too technical, on the nitty-gritty of what synthesized sound is and how it's made?
Yeah, well, like I said, the theremin was the first completely electronic instrument. There were instruments before that basically amplified acoustic phenomena. So you needed a microphone for that, but then you can pick up small sounds, you can do something with them. And there was this design that later went on to be, was it the Wurlitzer organ? There's a design with small rotors that through turning, they create different voltage changes. So like a small wheel turns faster than a larger wheel. And basically by using different sizes of wheels inside magnets, you can create changing voltages. But all of this is like a electromechanical contraption. So the theremin is the first instrument where there's like two oscillating circuits for each antenna. And one of them is fixed. And one of them changes when something changes the capacitance of the field. So there's an electromagnetic field. Every time a current goes through a wire, there's this field. And as you have experienced definitely with old-fashioned radios, when you touch the antenna, it can make the reception better or worse. With old tube radios, when you moved around, you shouldn't put your hand into a tube radio. But some people they touch electronic stuff, and you can see that something changes because your body becomes part of the circuit. So, but this allows you to change this one variable kind of, and the instrument generates pitches and voltage changes for volume by basically comparing the one circuit, the oscillator that doesn't change, and the one that does change. So this is a very, very important part of creating sounds purely electronic. And it's interesting that Robert Moog originally started building theremins in the US. So he had an affinity with electronic sound production, and also with everything that goes into building and designing such an instrument. And at some point, it appears that people came to him and said, yeah, these sounds are really, really great. Could we have them, could we play these sounds with a regular keyboard? So it's really interesting to see historically that two kinds of electronic music evolved in the US on the East and on the West Coast. Mr. Moog was on the East Coast. And what he does is basically he works with oscillators, which are components that create certain electronic waves. And you can take these changes of voltage, and you can convert them into changes in pressure. So you have a speaker that is moving. So it's easy to realize that if you have this wave motion and you move it out and you move the air in a certain way, you're going to get something that it's called a sine wave, technical tech speak kind of. And if it's
just to remind people, right, a sine wave is just a simple up and down.
Very simple up and down. And this is something that has very little overtones. It's a very pure sounding wave. And of course, it gets more interesting if you change the shape of the wave. So if you have like a rectangular wave which turns on and turns off, turns on and turns off, it's going to be very difficult for the speaker to move like that, and it's going to be much harsher. And this harshness basically creates all kinds of overtones, interesting overtones. Then there's other types like what's it called?
Triangular waves.
Triangular waves, yeah, basically like a sawtooth waves. And you can take these and put them into the second component that Robert Moog was, I think, instrumental in designing, which is a filter. And you can take out some of these frequency components, the high frequencies, the low frequencies. You can change. You can make it more mellow. If you take out the high, you can make it like less bassy by taking out the low frequencies. And then, of course, well, something similar happened on the West Coast, but in a different way. It was not driven by basically the idea that you would use something like a keyboard to play these sounds, but it was basically about creating these sounds and possibly creating like drones. And Mr. Buchler was on the West Coast. He did lots of very interesting designs. So we talk about oscillators, filters, and the next thing is, how does a sound start? Because if you just turn it on and you turn it off, it's like not so interesting. Usually acoustic instruments, they have like a phase where they do not resonate yet. So you blow into double reeds, for example. If you don't have the right pressure and of the air and of the lips, they're not going to vibrate properly. But at some point they start, and this is like a different event than the event that happens once the note is established and sustained. And the same with a violin. You put your bow on the string, you move it, and first you have like a kind of attack sound when you start producing the sound. If it's like very gentle, you can kind of mask it. But as soon as the bow moves, you can change the speed, you can tilt it sideways, and you have all kinds of possibilities. And some of these attack things also, like how a key is hit hard or softer, they can be programmed with an envelope thing. Different kinds exist, but it's not so easy
to jump in here, an envelope describing how a note starts and what happens in the middle and how it ends, basically.
Yeah, how it tapers off.
It changes through the note.
And this is something that distinguishes many electronic instruments, that they don't necessarily have the variability that you as a acoustic instrument performer have. When you start a note, when you work with your embouchure, when you play something with a mouthpiece like a horn or a trumpet. And you can also, you can play your horn. You can also try to talk or to sing. So there's like, I don't know, infinite possibilities of modifying that. And you could possibly find a way of like taking one and modeling that and putting it into your instrument. But then the horn player says, yeah, well, I can do like 100 more, model that.
Right. And of course, a lot of early electronic instruments were used in old science fiction movies and the soundtracks, and that sound of that boop, 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 that's very inhuman, often would represent the robot or the computer, and its very inhumanness made it perfect for that, but also made it less perfect for being an expressive instrument in the way we think of the oboe or the horn or the violin.
How did you come across the Continuum?
So why don't you describe the Continuum first, and then I'll tell you how I came across it.
Okay. So, well, I'm just trying to think when I saw it first. I think it first came to my attention when the Continuum Mini Kickstarter campaign was launched. So the idea of the Continuum, developed by Lippold Haken, I think beginning in the 80s, the 1980s, until about 1999, was to design an electronic instrument with the expressiveness of a string instrument, which is very, very sensitive to pressure and small changes of, for example, yeah, like your finger that's moving over a string. An instrument that would capture all of these possibilities and uh, enable polyphony. So a theremin can only play one line because you only have this one hand for the pitch and you need the other one for the volume.
So no chords, no two notes at the same time.
No, I mean, you could feed that into an effects device, then you can do stuff, but the instrument cannot actually do that. You could also use your volume hand for another musical line, but then you would have to use a foot for a foot pedal, for example, which is possible. But the thing is that there is a great theremin player, Pamelia Kirsten. She's one of the people that really also inspired me, besides Clara Rockmore, who was the first theremin virtuoso in the US. And she said it's the yoga instrument. So you establish your posture, you quiet your breath, and you focus on what you want to do. And for me, like the idea of putting my foot on a foot pedal also, it like doesn't gel, just doesn't work. So anyway, you have this one line, and what I went, so the idea behind the Continuum is to have this playability with possibly many fingers at the same time, and using the expressiveness of a string instrument. And well, this instrument, like I said, took about 20 years to develop to a point where it was originally used to control a sound design platform called Kyma. It was like it still is the main input device as far as I know for that platform. It's like a special software for sound design. Supposedly it's like, I don't know, the Holy Grail. Quite amazing. Anyway, in 1999, there was a lucky meeting of Mr. Egan, who bought the first Continuum to use with his Kyma station, Edmund Egan, and he got really attracted to it and supposedly said, well, it would be great if this instrument also would create sound. So Lippold say, yeah, we could. I mean, it has lots of processing power. It's the fastest, the lowest latency device I've ever heard of.
And to explain to people, latency occurs when you push the button of an instrument to play and there's a slight delay before you hear the sound. So eliminating that latency is a real goal of electronic instruments. It's very frustrating to hit something that produces a drum sound and have to wait a split second before you hear the sound.
Yeah, even though, I mean, the interfaces now, they usually have a latency of like 1 millisecond, which is, quite small. But some people, they really get nervous if it's 1.5 or 2 or 3 milliseconds. They say, oh, I cannot play. Actually, it's a very small distance that sound would take to travel. So if you played something a bit further away until it reaches you, it would take about the same time. But still, this computing power inside this instrument was enough to also integrate a synthesizer. So this is what happened in the next 10, 15, 20 years, is that basically this collaboration of the instrument hardware designer and sound designer, they built this incredible instrument. And at some point, they had the idea to launch a version that was more affordable, because this instrument is like boutique built. So it is expensive because the components are expensive and very few of them are built basically in the spare time of the designer of the instrument. So I saw this campaign and I was thinking about buying one of these instruments. They're like a very portable, very light version of the Continuum, but basically you can only use 2 fingers. So one finger also registers your pitch position and your pressure. So you can imagine you have like this sheet.
Just like on a piano.
Well,
right?
just
One
like on a
the pressure produces different volumes and the position produces different notes.
Yeah, but of course on a piano, once you activate the action, then you can basically just determine how long the sustain is by not damping the string that you have hit. So that's why, I mean, the piano is under the percussive instrument category. There is things there's amazing expressiveness, of course, you can realize as a pianist, but one thing you cannot do is, like, once you have a note, you cannot make it softer, you can make it louder again. It's just like not possible. And with this instrument, you can do that, but the small version of the Continuum basically has one finger where it registers pitch and pressure, and also front back position. There's like all kinds of amazing things you can do. The second finger is also registered pitch wise, but the pressure is basically the same for the two fingers. I tried one of them here in Hamburg. A guy bought one, and I said, I love the sounds, but as a theremin player, you dream of playing your theremin polyphonally, of creating more than one musical line, and you cannot do it with the Mini. And then I came across, I joined the Continuum group a little while before that. I came across your post, and yeah.
So to make a very long story a lot shorter, I discovered the Continuum when I was setting up my lab at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and it's called the Electroacoustic Research Space, abbreviated to EARS. And I set up that lab by creating, well, I was applying for a grant to fund the lab, and I knew some of the things that I wanted to have, but I did not have anywhere near a thorough knowledge of electronic music. I was very much a beginner. And so I just started calling electronic musicians cold and introducing myself and saying, I'm applying for a grant to set up this lab. If you were applying for a grant to set up a lab, what would you put in it? What's interesting? What's fun? And I don't honestly even remember who recommended the Continuum, but the description seemed kind of cool. And I looked it up on YouTube to see some people playing it. And the first thing that I saw was an Indian musician playing it. And my mind was blown because, of course, many people, when they think of electronic music, think of this very primitive boop, boop, boop kind of sound. And this was a sound that flowed. You could slide between notes like that. You could do vibrato like that, and all played as if you were playing a piano. And what you actually touch on the Continuum is a foam pad that's painted to look a little bit like a piano keyboard. And I thought that sounded really cool, so I put it in my grant proposal. And when I got the grant, I of course bought the Continuum. I bought the full size one that's many octaves. I think it's 8 octaves or something like that. And it quickly became my favorite electronic instrument because it plays like an acoustic instrument, which is to say it has solved the problem of how to be expressive on an electronic instrument. And it's like a combination of the piano and the violin. The piano in being played with the fingers like this, but the violin in being able to slide and vibrate and do all those other things. So I absolutely loved the Continuum. And when I went for a semester to Paris in the fall, I knew that in order to do my research and composing, I needed to have a Continuum. And that's when I bought for myself the half-size Continuum, which is still plenty big. It's about between 3 and 4 feet wide, and has, I forget, 4 octaves maybe. Certainly plenty to produce the kinds of sounds that you need. And so I worked a lot with that instrument in Paris. And then when it was time to go home with our 5 gigantic suitcases, I thought, well, I could sell this instrument to somebody in Europe and go back home to my lab with its giant Continuum. So that was my experience. That's how we met. Today is the first time we've actually spoken, and it's always nice to put a face to the name. So that's my experience of the Continuum. And I know that just from being on the Facebook page for the Continuum, so many people consider this instrument to be the holy grail of electronic instruments, not only because of its expressiveness, but because of the uniqueness of the programming language that Ed Egan created, which is incredibly complicated, but also in some ways simple to understand, in which he lays out a matrix, and you say, take this activity by an oscillator and send it to this filter, and then take the output from that filter and send it back to a new oscillator, and so forth, and creating these maps of what happens to the sound. You have a world of possibilities of sound on top of this incredibly expressive way of playing them. So I was sold right from the start.
What I think is also really amazing is the tactile feedback that you get, because with a theremin, you of course have absolutely no tactile feedback. And the problem really with electronic instruments is that you produce the sound, but it comes out of the speaker. So the way I play my theremin, the setup is that I have the speaker usually behind my head or in the middle of my back, but pointing up, so that I'm standing in the line where the sound is moving. That also gives you a chance to very quickly adjust things because you hear them a bit earlier, and you can basically, together with the acoustic properties of the room, you can make your playing sound a little bit better than it would be otherwise. And with the Continuum, because you have this neoprene surface and then underneath you have these rods, it presses back, and when you press harder, you have this beautiful feedback that he just figured out the perfect feeling, I think, for that. It's just right. And because the sound there also comes out of some speaker you have somewhere. So I noticed when I played the small US tour in January, and I was very lucky to be invited to play in Atlanta, Georgia. I was invited by Klimchak. He's an improvising composer, percussionist. What did he call himself? He called himself a theremin playing, instrument building percussionist. I think that's he said that. That's like sums it up. So he also plays a theremin, and basically I played a solo set the first time, and I had gotten the Continuum not so long before that actually, but I found that it meshes beautifully. So it's possible to play some patches on the Continuum and then switch to the theremin and basically create like a drone or a backdrop for sounds you can then pick up on the theremin. Then you go back to the Continuum. There is this beautiful patch, The Long Goodbye, for example, that kind of oscillates through different permutations of what you played, and depending on what you do, it just like goes on longer or shorter and changes in some ways. And it's a little bit like a looper, but it's more like an organic looper, and they just did it, I think, in just the right way to be used in this way. And that's really amazing that in this instrument you have, I think, 450 patches, and each patch you have to learn how to play. But it's absolutely fantastic because you put on, you turn on your system, or you put on your headphones, you turn on your Continuum, it's available immediately, and you can just like dive into these spaces and learn the ways of playing each patch. And supposedly there's some nice videos out of ContinuumCon. Different Continuum players play very different styles. You see the same with the theremin. It's not like you can teach a certain technique. There's some things you just find for yourself that work, and that makes it also very malleable, I think. Very, very personal and very, very expressive.
I would completely agree. It's often been observed that talking about music makes people very anxious to hear music. And so I will make sure to post as many links as I can down in the comments to examples of Continuum playing. And we'll have the examples that you send as well go into the comments. And I invite anybody who's watching the video who has other links of things to listen to or watch to post them in the comments as well. So now in this time of isolation, you're not really able to get out and perform on these instruments.
Yeah.
Are you able to stay at home and nourish yourself by learning more, by practicing? What do you do in this time?
Yeah, well, the very nice thing about the Continuum is that I haven't enjoyed practicing this much in a long time. because it is not like I'm trying to with the violin to learn in an aria or something, to learn to play like some etude or something. I'm exploring the instrument, and I'm finding ways of creating sounds that are interesting for me. So I'm it's easy to spend like 1 or 2 hours just like practicing stuff. So this is very nice, and this time of course gives you a lot of opportunity if you're in a lucky position to be financially secured. It's, I think, much easier in many European countries than in other parts of the world. I think US also has things for artists, but here in Germany you could apply and you could get some money, so it can keep you going for a while. But I also found that according to the German not the German law, but the German arrangements now in COVID-19 times, it is expressly allowed to create streaming concerts with groups of musicians, as long as you adhere to the distance regulations. And of course, they're happy if you also watch out for the extra things. So basically, when the musicians come, you can open the door so they don't have to touch the handle. You have possibilities to wash your hands with soap and all of this. But in Germany, so in Hamburg and in Berlin, it is possible to organize streaming concerts if you have musicians that are open to that. And since we do not know how long the situation is going to take, this is something I will be exploring in Berlin. On Tuesday and Wednesday, I have 2 sessions planned right now. Tuesday with a tuba player, and Wednesday with a trombone player. We have not played together.
And I should explain that we are talking today is April 26th, 2020.
Yes.
Today.
That's right. So I will be streaming, and I will be experimenting using single lens digital reflex camera, DSLR. You can take the HDMI output of such a camera, and there's like small devices you can plug into that basically trick your laptop or your mobile phone or something, your smartphone or tablet, into thinking it's a webcam attached. So you can create like really nice looking video. And I'm also going to do multi-channel recording, and the stereo mix is going to go into this stream. So I hope to have really nice sound and video. And also after the stream, we'll be able to like remix stuff and release it in some other ways. So I'm looking at ways of creating interesting, exciting possibilities for musicians that can potentially also generate some revenue for the location. In this case, the location is closing down by the end of April. We are the last events that are happening there. And I think this is something quite interesting, because you definitely, with the free improvised music, you need the immediacy. And all the attempts right now to play together with some streaming, they have the problem of latency, and it's not a fixed latency as far as I know that you can get used to. It is probably going to change depending on the condition of the internet weather. So you have to be able to like hear something and react to that. Someone else is going to play or possibly not play, and this is all happening in a way that it has to be like, it has to at least feel like a real space. And well, I have another project I'm working on that could potentially work, but I think if you are allowed and you have the spaces, because the spaces are not being used currently, and you have musicians that say, okay, we can find a safe way to travel from my home where I'm in isolation to the place where you want to play without connecting with many people on public transport or ever. I mean, that's of course a risk, but if you can arrange that, I think it could be something interesting to experiment. So the idea is to have a very, very high quality of the audio video of the session. It has to be like something really special. It can't be like my evening practice session. I think there's lots of stuff like that on Facebook. And it's only interesting, I think, if you know the musicians personally, to check in and say, it's nice to hear something, but it's not really, it's not like the experience where you go to a concert to experience something that's going to be really unique. So we have to find some way to do this.
Well, that feels like a glimmer of hope through somewhat clouded times. So please keep me posted, and I will pass on links you send me in the comments. And it's been wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. It was great fun also to be talking to you almost in person. And I hope to see you sometime in the US or at the Continuum, which actually was supposed to take place in Portugal. Yeah, in a few days. So,
well, I hope we can meet face to face as well. Thank you so much.